My name is Lily, and I turned 18 earlier this year. As I write this, I reflect on how my life has changed, how everything I once knew turned upside down. I live in California with my parents in a spacious home we've had for years. Our family, fortunate in many ways, had never struggled financially. We lived comfortably, thanks to my father's hard work as a real estate agent. He's a man of great strength and resilience, with a rugged look that matches his personality. He's always been my role model, someone I admire for his confidence and determination. My mother, on the other hand, is the heart of our family. She's a kind and gentle teacher who always puts us first, patient, caring, and unwavering in her support. It wasn't until much later that I truly appreciated the warmth and love she gave me. For years, everything seemed perfect. Our family was well off, living in a cozy home surrounded by the things we loved. But that peace and security were shattered one fateful afternoon, and everything changed in the blink of an eye. It was a gloomy day, the sky overcast and heavy with dark clouds that seemed to hang over our house like a bad omen. My mother and I were in the kitchen preparing dinner, just as we had done countless evenings before. The kitchen was warm, filled with the comforting aroma of her soup simmering on the stove. Outside, the wind was cold, but inside, it felt like home. Then the phone rang, shattering the peaceful atmosphere. My mother answered it, and I could hear my father's voice on the other end. His tone immediately told me something was wrong. It wasn't his usual confident, steady voice, it was trembling, almost unrecognizable. He told her his company had gone bankrupt. The money was gone, and he had no way to pay off the debt. Everything had been lost. We would have to sell the house, our home, the place where I had grown up. I stood frozen as my mother's face paled in disbelief. She tried to stay calm, but I could see the fear and confusion in her eyes. "What will we do?" she asked him. "Tomorrow, you two must move back to the countryside," my father said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Go live with your grandfather. At least there we'll have a roof over our heads." His words hit me like a slap in the face. My father had always been strong, someone who could fix anything, but now he was asking us to leave everything behind and start over. The thought of moving to my grandfather's house filled me with dread. His home was in the countryside, a place I hadn't visited much in recent years. My grandmother had passed away years ago, and since then, he had lived alone in a rundown house that had only grown more dilapidated over time. My memories of him were filled with love. He had always spoiled me, treated me like his greatest treasure. But it had been so long since I'd seen him that his face was now a blur in my mind. The next morning, my mother and I packed our things in silence. My father had disappeared after breaking the news, leaving me to grapple with the reality of what was happening. It was just the two of us in the car as we drove out of the city. The landscape shifted from tall buildings and bustling streets to open fields and dirt roads. The air grew quieter, emptier, and an overwhelming sadness washed over me. It felt like I was leaving behind everything that had been my life. When we finally arrived at my grandfather's house, it felt like stepping into another world. The house looked just as I remembered, old and weathered by time. The roof had faded, and the paint on the walls had peeled away, revealing cracked bricks beneath. A large garden surrounded it, filled with fruit trees whose branches were heavy and tangled from neglect. I stepped out of the car hesitantly, unsure of what awaited me. This wasn't the warm, inviting home I had once known. It stood there like a relic from the past, a stark reminder of everything we had lost. Then the door creaked open, and there he was, my grandfather. He looked thinner than I remembered, his back hunched with age. His deep-set eyes seemed older and wiser, but also distant at first glance. When he saw us, he smiled warmly at me. But as his gaze lingered longer than felt comfortable, his eyes deeper than before, I noticed something different about him compared to when he'd spoiled me as a child. There was an intensity behind those familiar yet unfamiliar eyes that made me uneasy, despite myself trying hard not to let such thoughts take root within myself, because after all, this man raised part childhood too. Didn't he? For the first time since our family's downfall, I began to feel a slight sense of relief during those initial calm days. It was a chance for us to adjust to being together again after so many years apart. But soon, subtle changes crept in, and with each passing day, a growing unease settled over me. It wasn't just the direct interactions, it was the way he watched me, his gaze lingering even when I pretended not to notice. The tension thickened, especially when I overheard hushed conversations between others in the house, their words laced with unspoken concerns. His eyes seemed to follow me everywhere. Each time I caught him staring, that same unease washed over me. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the discomfort lingered whenever he was near. One afternoon with my mother in town, it was just my grandfather and me at the house. I sat in the living room, reading a book as sunlight streamed through the window, casting a soft glow on the floor. It felt peaceful, until he entered. He carried a plate of neatly peeled fruit, apples, pears, and oranges arranged with care. Placing it before me, he smiled gently. "You should eat," he said. "It's good for you." I thanked him and picked up an apple, taking a bite. But as I ate, I couldn't ignore his gaze. He sat across from me, his eyes fixed on mine. At first I thought he was simply resting there, but the silence stretched, and the weight of his stare grew unbearable. "You've really grown up," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "Just the other day I was carrying you around in my arms. Now you've become such a beautiful young woman." His words sent a jolt through me. I forced a smile, my cheeks flushing. "Yes," I murmured, avoiding his gaze. "Time flies." But his eyes didn't leave me. They burned into me, and the discomfort deepened. "The older you get," he continued, his tone low and unfamiliar, "the more beautiful you become. You look just like your mother did when she was young, so beautiful. But you have your own unique charm. No one else can compare." I didn't know how to respond. His words made my skin crawl, and my heart raced as I struggled to keep my composure. "You flatter me, Grandpa," I said lightly, though inside I was unraveling. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I used to carry you around the garden when you were little," he said wistfully. "You were always so chatty back then. But now, look at you. You've grown into such a graceful young woman with such a striking presence." I forced a faint smile, masking my unease. "Yes," I whispered, barely audible. "I remember those days." But he wasn't finished. "You're not just beautiful, Lily," he said, his eyes darkening with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "You're captivating. I'm sure the boys would be falling all over themselves for you." He paused, his voice lowering ominously. "I just hope there's someone good enough to take care of you." My heart sank as panic surged through me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the pages of my book, desperate for something to focus on. "I'm still young," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "It's too early to think about that." He smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and stood abruptly. "Yes," he said quietly before leaving the room without another word. I sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, his words echoing in my mind like a haunting refrain. From that moment on, everything between us changed. His gaze lingered longer, his tone grew heavier, and the air itself seemed charged with tension. One morning soon after, when it was just him and me again, he approached with an expression darker than anything I had ever seen before. "Lily," he said softly but firmly, his tone laced with something unsettling, "I want you." My body froze, every muscle locked tight as fear gripped me entirely. "Grandpa," I whispered hoarsely, my voice trembling uncontrollably, "you can't say that. You're my grandfather." But instead of backing away or apologizing as some desperate part of me hoped he would, he stepped closer until there was no space left between us. "I've thought about this for so long," he murmured, his lips pressed tightly together as if holding back something darker still. "And then, you're so beautiful. You've grown into such perfection, and now these feelings inside won't let go anymore." Panic surged anew as realization dawned fully upon me. Too late, perhaps, but undeniable nonetheless. We stood face to face while worlds crumbled silently beneath our feet, connected yet impossibly distant despite everything happening around us. "No," escaped weakly past my lips, barely audible but firm enough to break the spell. Though he realized what he had done, he spoke softly, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have said that." He took a slow step back, his eyes clouded with guilt. I stood frozen in place as he walked away, leaving behind an unspoken distance neither of us could bridge again. Eventually, my parents managed to stabilize our lives, and we left my grandfather's house behind. As we drove away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, relief because the growing tension and unease were finally behind me, but sadness because the relationship with my grandfather could never be the same again. Through the car window, I caught one last glimpse of him standing in the garden, his face etched with regret and sorrow. The weight of everything that had happened pressed on me, but it no longer mattered. This experience taught me a hard lesson: the importance of respecting boundaries, especially within family relationships. Trusting your instincts and speaking up when something feels wrong is vital. Silence can deepen wounds and lead to lasting emotional harm. If something makes you uncomfortable, voice your feelings and seek support from those you trust. Protect yourself and nurture relationships built on mutual respect and understanding.